All right. Do you know the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs?
Yes.
Today we are going to present Snow White and the Nine Dwarfs, which is a little bit different. Once upon a time, there was an evil queen. She had a magic mirror. She could ask it any question and it would tell her the honest answer. So one day she asked the mirror,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?"
Snow White is the fairest.
The evil queen was so angry, jealous of Snow White, that she immediately sent a servant to kill Snow White. But Snow White got away and fled into the forest. Snow White was wandering through the forest, very upset and afraid, when suddenly Snow White came upon a small house. She knocked on the door. And inside she found 9 small dwarfs who invited her to come in. And she said,
Who are you?
My name is Love. My name is Joy.
My name is Peace.
My name is Patience.
My name is Kindness.
My name is Gwyneth.
My name is Faithful.
My name is gentleness.
My name is Self-Control.
Snow White told them that she had nowhere to stay for the night, and they invited her to live there with them. And she said, well, this is a strange, tiny house, and you are tiny, strange dwarves, but I guess if I have nowhere else to go, I will stay here. Can someone get me a drink, please? And Love happily brought her a nice, cool drink. Snow White looked around at the tiny house. How can you live this way? I'm used to living in the big palace with all the finest furniture and servants and fancy balls. I don't know how I will ever be happy here. But Joy replied, I've lived here all my life. I have everything I need and I feel so content here. Snow White could see that Joy was blind and wondered how she could ever be happy in such a miserable existence. Snow White began to tell the dwarves that the evil queen was trying to kill her. She was so terrified and afraid that she would be discovered. She could never even sleep for fear that the queen would find her and have her killed. But Peace told her not to fear and read Jesus' comforting words to her from John 16:33. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Snow White suddenly realized how very hungry she was. Patience offered to prepare a meal for her. Snow White asked for cachin beef, her favorite dish that she always ate in the palace. Patience had to run to the other room to try to make some cachin beef. Patience was gone in the other room a little bit longer than the drama originally predicted, but eventually Patience came back with cachin beef. Patience had never made cachin beef before, but tried his best and brought it to Snow White. Snow White took one bite and spat it out. I can't eat this, it's too sour. Make it again. Make it spicier, she said. Patience patiently went back to the kitchen 4 or 5 more times, trying to make the cachin beef the way that Snow White liked it. Enough. Snow White was not only beautiful, but she was proud of her beautiful voice. When she would sing, little birdies would come and circle around her and perch on her shoulders.
Lavender's blue, dilly dilly, lavender's green. Then I am king, dilly dilly, you shall be.
And when the little birdies would come and circle around her and perch on her shoulders, it annoyed Snow White greatly. Get away from me, you horrid bird, she shouted at them. She swatted the birds away. But kindness and goodness came and comforted the poor birds and gave them something to eat. Every day, the 9 dwarves would go to the forest to work, but Snow White stayed home to rest. One day before they left, they noticed it looked like it might rain. They asked Snow White to please close the windows if it rained, and Snow White said, okay, I will. But Snow White fell asleep. She didn't notice when it began to rain, and she forgot to close the windows. But Faithfulness came back to check. Faithfulness came back to check. Faithfulness noticed that Snow White was sleeping. Faithfulness quietly closed all the windows and then went back to work. When all the dwarves came home, they thanked Snow White for closing all the windows. Snow White said, "Thank you." Faithfulness just smiled. The dwarves were very tired from a hard day's work, but Snow White was very disgusted with how dirty the house was. She began to shout at the dwarves and demand that they clean it up. Gentleness very gently replied, "Okay, we will." And he gently asked the other dwarves if they would help him clean up. The next day, the dwarves went out to work, and Snow White again stayed home to rest. Snow White sat there thinking about these strange little dwarves. She was amazed by the way they lived their lives, always putting the needs of others above their own. They had a calmness deep inside. Where did it come from? Snow White wished she was more like them, but she knew she was much too selfish and far too weak. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was the evil queen, wearing a disguise. She had found out where Snow White was through the help of her magic mirror, and she was holding a basket of poisoned apples. She pretended to offer them to Snow White as a gift. Snow White accepted them eagerly. She loved apples, and she hadn't had any apples since she left the palace. She took them inside, set them down, and began to look at the apples. She thought, what will the dwarves do? She would have to wait until everyone was home and share the apples. But Snow White didn't want to share the apples. She wanted the apples all for herself. But the house was small. There was no place to hide them. So she decided to eat all the apples before the dwarves came home. She picked up an apple, and just as Snow White was about to take a bite, Self-Control came home. "Snow White, what are you doing?" Snow White was so annoyed at Self-Control for spoiling her selfish plan, she shouted, "These are my apples! I'm going to eat them all, and you can't have any!" Self-Control recognized Snow White's great selfishness and rude manners, but decided to encourage Snow White rather than shouting back at her. Self-Control said, "Snow White, you'll be sick if you eat all these apples. Why don't you just have one?" And Self-Control also had a very keen sense of smell. He picked up one of the apples, smelled it, and immediately knew something was wrong. "Stop, Snow White! Don't eat it! It's poison!" Snow White stopped just in time. "The evil queen must have found me and done this. You saved my life," she said to Self-Control. But just then, all the other dwarves came home. As the dwarves came home, Snow White began to cry. "I am such a rotten person. I only think of myself and I'm so empty inside. I don't want to be like this anymore. Please help me change." "Of course we will," the Fruit of the Spirit said, the dwarf said, and they all gave her a big group hug. And they left the stage singing, "Hi-ho,
Hi-ho, hi-ho, to work we go. Hi-ho, 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 to work we go. Hi-ho, hi-ho."
All right.